Today we're going to turn these yarn scraps into the cutest little fall pumpkins. This is such a quick and easy project. You can knock it out in a single sitting. You only need yarn scraps to do it. Whether you're looking for a creative way to use up your yarn scraps or you just need a relaxing project to add a little bit of fall coziness to your home, this is the perfect way to do it. And we'll keep it super simple. In less than 2 hours, you'll have a finished pumpkin. So I made both of these pumpkins with some Lion Brand Scarfie in my stash. This is by far one of my favorite yarns to turn to when I'm crocheting pumpkins because I just really love how the colors work and how they turn into a pumpkin. It's one of my favorite yarns. If you have some Scarfie in your stash, definitely one to consider for this project. But it's a scrap yarn project. You don't have to have Scarfie unless you have Scarfie scraps. So for the next pumpkin, I don't have any more Scarfie to use, but I did find this lovely ball of gorgeous yarn, and that's what I want to use. I have no clue what this yarn is because I haven't always been so good at keeping track of my yarn labels after winding them up. I mean, if we're being honest, I'm still not good at that. So I literally have no clue what this yarn is, but I do sense that it is an okay thickness. Let's talk about that first. So Scarfie, if you're familiar with it, is a number 5 bulky weight yarn. So that's the target, we'll say, for crocheting this pumpkin, but it's not a requirement by any means. You can size up or size down based on the yarn that you have available to you. So this does look to be a little bit thicker than Scarfie. I'm guessing this is probably a number 6 yarn, and so we'll adjust accordingly. That brings me into the hook size. If you're using Scarfie or if you have a number 5 bulky weight yarn, I would start off with a 6mm crochet hook. That should get the job done. It works really well for Scarfie, but it should work pretty well for other bulky weight yarns as well. But since I know this one's a little bit thicker, I'm worried that this will be just a teeny bit too small. So I'm going to size up and go to a 6.5mm. I think that'll work a little bit better. Now, alternatively, if you're working with a medium weight yarn, something like this or this, which we'll plan on using for the stem and the leaf later on, I would size down a little bit, maybe consider going to a 5.5. The most important thing is that you find the right balance in your hook size and your yarn so that your stitches aren't so open and airy that you can see the stuffing through it, but it's also not so tight and dense that you can't form a really cute pumpkin. So you might have to play around with it a little bit based on the scraps that you have and that you're using for this project. So let's see how this 6.5mm does with this yarn. I'll be your guinea pig, so you don't have to try to figure it out on your own. So this project starts off with a chain that has 38 stitches, or 38 chains. I said that really weird. Chain 38, and you'll have the start of this pumpkin. Okay. Then once you have your chain, we can join to the first chain. And so we're crocheting just a simple tube here. Now, one thing I did find that works best is to work in the back bump of the chain. A lot of times it's really easy to work in like the side loop here, but that makes the second round a little bit harder. So find your first chain, rotate it over so that you see the back side, and then slip stitch in the back bump of that chain. Then we'll chain 1, which doesn't count as a stitch, and go ahead and single crochet in that same chain. So we're just getting our first row of stitches set up here, and we just want to have a single crochet in every chain for this first round. So I don't want you to find this out the hard way. We're working with a different stitch. A really interesting stitch that looks like knitting, but obviously we're crocheting. Before we get to that stitch though, we can make our lives a little bit easier by making these stitches a little bit looser than we normally would. You'll see why later, but just take my word for it. Make your single crochets a little looser than normal. So the pattern for this project is completely free on my website. You can find that link in the description below. And it's, one of the best ways to learn how to read a crochet pattern or just get more confidence with reading patterns if you're, still a little bit more comfortable watching a video than you are reading a pattern. Having them side by side is the best way to overcome that. It's really simple though. It's probably a great pattern to learn how to read patterns because there's not a lot that goes into it. It's a super simple project. So at the end of the round, make sure your chain isn't twisted. That's really important to keep crocheting as we go on to the next round. But you can double check your stitch count too. You should have 38. If you're off by 1 or 2, honestly, it's not a huge deal. Basically, how big this is the circumference of the pumpkin. It'll shrink a teeny bit, but not much. So if you want a bigger pumpkin, one that's wider, make more chains. Or if you want a pumpkin that's a little bit smaller, make fewer chains. There's no multiple with this. You can add or remove chains however you see fit. And there's one other thing to keep in mind when you're changing the size of the pattern. We'll get to that in a little bit. Now, if you look at this pumpkin, you'll notice right away that this is an interesting stitch because it looks like knitting. It looks like the stockinette. There is a way that you can make this with your crochet hook, and it's one of my favorite stitches. It has to be done crocheting in the round, so it's great for pumpkins, for hats, for mittens, for wrist warmers, for leg warmers, anything that you're going to crochet in a tube, you can use this stitch for. And it's really simple. It's not too different from the normal single crochet. The only thing that changes is the placement. Normally, you would crochet right here, right? Or you could use the back loop or the front loop only, and that's like a normal placement for a single crochet. For the waistcoat stitch, you work it through the front of the single crochet. So basically right here. If you look really close at a single crochet, you'll notice there's a V on the front. I'm going to show you on some of these other ones that aren't next to my join there. See how there's a V? That's the front of the stitch. So you'll put your hook through the middle of the V, and that's the placement for the waistcoat stitch. Now let's flip it over and look at the back. So you'll notice on the back of a single crochet, we have more V's, but we also have this little bar that, kind of wraps around the bottom of it. You want your hook to come through the middle of this V as well. So as we look at this stitch, we'll go in through the middle, and we'll notice when we come out, we're in the middle of that V. So keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is this first round of waistcoat stitches is kind of fiddly, especially because we've got the chain here. This is why we work in the back bump of the chain. But usually what I like to do is put my finger on the back side of the single crochet because I can sort of feel where my hook is. So I'll just poke it right through the middle of the stitch. You can double check to make sure you're on the right track, but the easiest way to figure that out is just yarn over and pull through. And if your yarn is coming from the middle of the V, you know that you've got it in the right spot. So single crochet like normal, only change there is just the placement of it. And you can mark it with a stitch marker if you want to, but honestly, we don't need to keep track of rounds. We're not increasing or decreasing, and we're not crocheting a certain number of rounds, so I'm just going to go with it. We'll use a measurement instead. So find that next stitch, single crochet. The other thing I like to keep in mind when I'm working the waistcoat stitch is you have to make your stitches pretty loose. See how far I'm pulling up on that? Technically, we're starting the stitch lower than we normally would, and I want these loops to be roughly at the same height, so that's why I do it. But the other reason is that it makes your life a lot easier on the subsequent rounds. Man, I really wish I knew what yarn this is because I want to be able to tell you about it, and I want to be able to buy more for myself, but I really have no idea what this yarn is, unfortunately. But I'm really loving how it's crocheting up. Usually whenever you work with a tonal yarn like this, and crochet projects at least, it gives you just a really interesting color pattern. It obviously is different based on the stitch, the size of the project, the size of your hook, and the size of the color variations in the yarn. But generally speaking, you usually get a pretty cool mosaic kind of color pattern to it all. So we'll see how this one looks in the end, but gosh, right now I love it. And I'm thinking the 6.5 millimeter is the way to go for a super bulky weight or number 6 yarn. I think you're pretty safe on that. See how we don't have a lot of open and airiness to the stitches? Obviously you can see the openness at the very top, but between the stitches we don't have a lot of openness. So we shouldn't have to worry about seeing the stuffing through this pumpkin, and that's generally my number one concern, but it still has an okay drape to it. This stitch pattern by nature is more dense, less stretchy and flexible, and is a little bit more rigid. So expect that when you're crocheting up your pumpkin, but know that as long as it's not overly stiff, you should still be able to shape it into a pumpkin and it'll be just fine. Even if your first pumpkin doesn't turn out the way you want it to, you'll more than likely learn from that and say, okay, maybe for the next pumpkin I'll use a different size hook, or for the next pumpkin I'll use a different yarn, and see how it works. Yeah, this is definitely going to be my favorite pumpkin. Gosh, I wish I knew what this yarn was. I'm so sorry I can't tell you what yarn it is because I just have no clue. We're definitely going to have a bigger circumference just because it's a thicker yarn. I'm using a thicker hook. It's a little bit bigger, so I think I want to make it a little bit longer as well. If you're using Scarfie or a number 5 yarn and you've got your 6 millimeter crochet hook, you'll want this to measure about 4.5 inches from the starting edge, and that'll give you a pumpkin that's roughly this thick. I think this is a fun size. What if you want to make a completely different sized pumpkin? Well, that's really easy as well. Something that's taller than these. Well, that is changed by the height that you make this piece that we're crocheting here. So for these ones, I crocheted until it measured about 4.5 inches from my starting edge. So from here to about 4.5 inches. But I think for this one, I would like this one to be a little bit taller. I think it'll look really cute to have it sort of in the background of these two, maybe back here, and it's a little bit taller. So instead of 4.5, I'm going to try crocheting until it's 5.5. Did I say that right? Instead of 4.5, I'm going to crochet until it's 5.5 and see what that looks like. A project like this is so forgiving for experimentation that I think it's just one of the best scrap yarn projects because you have a little bit of time invested, not too much. It doesn't matter what size it comes out in the long run because it doesn't have to fit a certain way. So if nothing else, I hope this project serves as a good excuse to experiment and learn. But not only that, I can't tell you how energized I have been about crocheting projects lately because I'm shopping my stash. You'd be surprised at how much of a boost of motivation just using a yarn you're really excited about will give. So that's my long-winded version of why I love scrap yarn projects so much. So I said initially I wanted to stop around 5.5 inches. We're just to that right now, but I think I want to go a little bit further. I really want this to be noticeably taller than these other two, not like double the height or anything, but I want it to look intentional, that I purposefully made this one a little bit taller and it didn't just happen that way by chance. So instead of 5.5, I'm going to go to 6 inches and see where that gets me. All right, I think that did the trick. Yes, so we are right at 6 inches. I have a theory, not a proven one, but I think that we're losing about 2 inches of height with the formation of the pumpkin, because these ones, remember, I crocheted up to 4.5 inches, and they're about 2.5 inches tall, not including the little stem up at the top. So I'm thinking that this one should roughly be about 4 inches. We'll see if that's the case once we get a little bit further. But now's the fun part. I love the assembly of these pumpkins. It's super easy. So we do have a little bit of a jog here because we worked in a spiral. So you can slip stitch in the next one and it kind of works it down. It really doesn't matter. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but it's a good little trick to make that happen. And we need a really, really long tail at this point. You can, I don't know, you could probably take a more structured approach to figuring out how long your tail needs to be, but I like to live on the edge, and I'm just gonna grab a whole big bunch of it and hope that I grabbed enough. Basically, we're gonna use this tail to close up this side and then close up that side and then make the segments, you know, that pull them together to make it shaped a little bit more like a pumpkin. The best way that I found to close these up is with a drawstring closure. For the pumpkins that I made earlier, I worked them about every 2 stitches. And you just have to go in and out. And this is a total pain when you have a tail that's this long, but it's either make a tail that's this long and have it be a little bit inconvenient, or cut and add a bunch of tails and have to add more. It's totally up to you. You can do whatever you want, but yeah, it's not too bad. And you know, you can totally do whatever is comfortable for you, however you like to make a drawstring closure. You know, do what works best for you, what you're already comfortable with. You'll get the better results that way if you're doing something you're more comfortable with. The one thing you do have to do is do, you know, a full circle. But once you do, you can pull on the tail and it'll draw it up. And it looks super messy and not good, but it's really, really easy to fix. So the one thing you really want to be careful of, especially if you're using Scarfie yarn, Scarfie is a roving style yarn, or a single ply. So it's basically just one big twist of yarn. And as you're weaving in and out, it's really easy to untwist that yarn. And it has nothing to do with the fact that it's Scarfie, and everything to do with the fact that it's a single ply yarn, and it gets its strength from twisting. So as you're making your stitches for your drawstring, if you untwist a single ply yarn, no matter which yarn it is, it's going to lose strength. So when you pull on that, it has a tendency to break if you've untwisted it any. But the one thing you can do, just keep an eye on your twist. You can even introduce a little bit more twist into it. That'll make it a little bit stronger when you pull. So you really just want to get it closed to this point like this, and then we can do some work to tidy things up. I find that I like the way a finished drawstring closure looks when I work off of these tall points. And what I mean by that is run my needle under that one, and then the next one, we'll run this all the way through, and then find the next couple. And I'm not really sticking my needle through a particular stitch or anything like that. The main thing is that I'm catching those tall points, and for me it just looks a lot neater that way. But again, this is all experimentation. This is your pumpkin. Whatever looks good to you is what you should do. Once you get it closed off like that and you're pretty happy with how it looks, run the needle through the middle and out the other side. And this tail from the very beginning, we're not going to do anything with it. So you can just tuck it inside. We'll pretend like it's not there. And this one, I've been taking sort of a shortcut and just running my needle through the starting chain, I'm catching both of those loops, so it's just a little bit stronger that way. And you'll see why here in just a second. So it looks like this on the inside. I don't know if you can see the strand there. I'm not worried about this. This is going to get stuffed, and so it doesn't matter if we've got this random string in the middle. This is preventing us from having to cut another piece of yarn, attaching it, and then creating another drawstring, which is what we'll do next. So for this, I like to use the same sort of principles. I like to skip the same number of stitches so it looks the same on the top and the bottom. Not that it really matters because you don't see the bottom as much, but just for the sake of consistency, we'll skip every couple of stitches. You can catch your little jog there from the beginning and just run back and forth. And then we want to draw this up and close it, but we don't want to close it completely until we stuff it first. So a couple things. You'll need some polyfill stuffing or just some kind of fiber fill stuffing. And you can even go as far as to put some weighted beads down in the bottom. I haven't tried that yet, but I've been wanting to see if it works. I don't have any of that, so right now I'm just going to stuff it with my little polyfill here. And you know, this is another one of those instances where you learn from each pumpkin. I've found that when I feel like it's almost too stuffed, I'm pretty happy with how it looks. Because when you pull all this together and you scrunch it down and make the segments, if you don't have enough stuffing in there, then you can have some sections of your pumpkin that's not like really full, and I don't know, to me it just doesn't look quite as good that way. But you obviously don't want to have so much stuffing that it's stretching out your stitches and you can see the stuffing in between. So you may have to experiment a little bit on this one. I think that's probably enough stuffing, but I guess we'll find out later when it's too late to add more. So yeah. And then just like we did on the bottom side, I just like to run my needle just through these raised parts. We'll tidy it up that way. See how much neater it looks when you focus on those raised points? I pretty much don't do a drawstring without that. And they get neater and neater the more you go around. Usually find that going around 2 full times is pretty good. I definitely like the look of this side better than this side, so I think I want this to be the top part of the pumpkin. You can decide whichever you like the look of best. So I'll just make a stitch and come out through the middle because I want to start making these segments in the middle of the pumpkin. So the segments are probably easier than you would imagine. Just run it along the outside of it and poke your needle through the middle of the bottom side. And you'll probably have to scrunch it down and poke it as close to the center as you can. Pull up on it. And this is basically one giant whip stitch that we're making here. So then just, again, very carefully pull on it. Be mindful of your yarn and how much it has untwisted itself, because remember, if it untwists, that means it's not nearly as sturdy as it could be. So I like to pull it really tight, as tight as I feel comfortable, and hold on to it with my fingers so I know it's not going to, spring back, because right now it very well could. And then you'll just make the next segment in the same way. Fold it over, poke it in through the back, and out the top. There we go. We totally shifted it over there. If you don't like the placement, you can easily just pull it back out a little bit. And then reposition it. For this pattern, I think 5 segments works the best. See how we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pumpkin segments? So that's what I'm going for. You can increase that number, decrease it, whatever you think looks good. I always try to make these pumpkins look perfect, but then I realize that like pumpkins aren't perfect. So it's kind of silly to waste a whole bunch of time trying to make them perfect. But I do know that I want this to be the top of the pumpkin and this to be the bottom of the pumpkin. Make sure I place my needle not through the same exact hole as where it's coming from, just so I don't undo a stitch. And just run it through the bottom. Just leave a few inches so you can have something to comfortably tie to. And then we'll move into the stem. So there's just a little bit of crocheting left. I'm going to go with this color, I think, for the stem. I don't know. What do you think? I don't know if that's the right answer, this color here. It's kind of fun. I do want to incorporate some of this color into it, but it might be too different from these two. I think if we use this color, the same yarn there, that might be a good way to go. And then maybe we'll use this for the leaf color instead of this. Or should we use this for the stem? We should use this for the stem. Totally. Okay. Now this yarn is technically a little bit thinner than the number 5 that I used for these 2 pumpkins, but you know, experimenting. We're gonna see if this works. It should work out. I'm not too worried about it. So the stem is just a few rounds, just takes a couple of minutes to crochet. You will want to switch to one of your smaller crochet hooks. I'm using a 5 for this one. I also used a 5 for the Scarfie yarn. You basically just want to use a smaller crochet hook so that you have a really tight condensed sort of stem. You can play around with it and see what works. I'm also starting with the magic ring. If I can get myself started. There we go. Just a personal preference here. You can start your round however you're comfortable, whatever works best for you. The bottom line is you want 5 stitches in your first round, which is 1 less than what I would normally use for a single crochet. And that's intentional because we want the stem to be just a little bit smaller and it doesn't have to be perfectly round. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Close up that round. And no increasing here at all. And crocheting in a spiral. I'm not worried about stitch count or anything like that, so I'm not even going to mark this first stitch. I'm just going to make a single crochet in every stitch. This is the normal placement too. I'm not using the waistcoat stitch for this, so we're not crocheting in the middle of the stitch. Just the usual stitch placement. And you can play around with the size of your stem too. If you need it to be a little bit wider, then I would go maybe 6 or 7 stitches in your first round. Still, you don't really need to increase unless you're making it way, way bigger. And the length you can play around with as well. I kind of like a shorter sort of stem, especially for those smaller Scarfie ones that I made first. And those have about 4 rounds of single crochet. I think for this one, since this pumpkin is a teeny bit bigger than the other 2, it's actually noticeably bigger than the other 2, but I think I'm going to shoot for maybe 5 or 6 rounds. Okay, let's see what that gets me. I'm not going to fasten off in case I want to change it, but it's pretty good. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good height. So what do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have 5 rounds for this slightly bigger version. So when you fasten off here, leave a tail that's, you know, just long enough to sew to your pumpkin. Just I don't know, 6 or 7 inches is plenty. And that'll give you enough to run it through to the bottom, which is where we'll tie it off. So I'll just pull that through. And the starting tail, I like to use to stuff it. I don't actually put any stuffing in the stem because it's just not nearly big enough, but you can use the tail here to, you know, give it a little bit of body. So when I'm sewing this in place, again, experiment, do what works best for you, whatever's easiest for you. I don't run it all the way through the pumpkin until the very end, and I just like to sew it using the little segments of the pumpkin. So I just really caught a big hunk of material there and then pull that into place. Grab another stitch in the side and then just grab another stitch in the pumpkin. I've got about 5 stitches here, so that's a pretty good placement. I feel pretty comfortable that that'll stay in place, and then I'll run it through the bottom. So then I'll tie these two off so they're nice and sturdy, but don't trim these yet. We have one more thing to sew into place. The thing that I really like about this leaf is it's different than like every other leaf and how you crochet it. So grab your leaf yarn and your even smaller crochet hook. We're working with 3 hook sizes for this project. So the biggest one for the pumpkin, the medium one for the stem, the smallest one for the leaf. And again, the pattern is spelled out for you. You don't have to have any of this memorized. For this one, we'll start with 11 chains. So find the second chain from the hook and slip stitch there. I'm just using the side loop too. I think it's a little bit easier for this leaf than using the back bump. So slip stitch, the next chain, single crochet, and the next one, half double crochet. Whoops. And then double crochet in the next 2 chains. Then half double crochet, and single crochet. So that's half of the leaf worked. And with that, you should have 3 chains left over. And we need to work the other side now. So the way we'll do that is flip it over, keep everything attached, find the same chain that your last single crochet is coming from. So for me, it's right here. See, that's the single crochet. Make a single crochet in the same chain on the opposite side. And it'll kind of wrap up and just give you the perfect leaf shape. And then half double crochet in the next chain, double crochet in the next 2, then half double crochet, single crochet. So we're just working all of that back in reverse, and you should have 1 chain left. You'll slip stitch, and that's your leaf. I do like to save this tail for sewing it to the pumpkin, but for this one, we'll just tidy it up and weave it in. So figure out where you want it to be, and then just stick your needle from the top to the bottom and pull it through. Make sure you're happy with the placement, but look how cute, how it just sits like that. I don't know, I love it. And then you can just tie this off on the bottom with some of your other tails, and you don't really have to worry about weaving them in. Now, if you're gifting this to somebody, or you really care about how tidy it looks on the bottom, you can totally weave these in. Actually, I think what I would do is thread it on a yarn needle and then poke it in just anywhere inside the pumpkin, and then poke your needle back out This is the trick that I use for amigurumi. And then just trim that off, and then it's lost in there forever. Super cute, this little bunch of pumpkins. Now, if you don't want to crochet the stem and the leaf, you really don't have to. I actually love using a cinnamon stick. It's a super cute way of coming up with a stick, or you could just run into the backyard, find a twig, break it off, hot glue it in place, and you've got a really natural looking, I guess, pumpkin stem. And for the leaves, you can crochet them. You can get some silk leaves and also hot glue them to your pumpkin. There's just so much you can do with crochet pumpkins, and that's why I love them so much. So while you can do a ton of experimentation and come up with pumpkins of all shapes, sizes, colors, textures, just by using different yarns in your stash and different hook sizes and different measurements as you're constructing these pumpkins, you don't have to experiment if you don't want to. And that's the beauty of this project. I have the free pattern written up for the Scarfie version of this pumpkin. It's linked in the description below. It's completely free on my website, but if you do want to support the channel or you like to have your patterns printed or saved to your device, I have that option for you in my shop as well. B.Hooked.com is our shop for all of our PDF patterns. We have some digital pattern bundles that I've curated, some fun projects I think that you'll like to work on, but you can also make your own bundles with some pattern discounts for buying multiples. We have some t-shirts if you're into that sort of thing, and we also have some printable cards, bands, and tags that you can add to your gifts. You can provide the care instructions, personalized notes with the cards, and that sort of thing. And if you find yourself on a pumpkin kick like me, this isn't the only way to crochet a pumpkin. Here is last year's pumpkin that I still absolutely adore. You can make some much bigger pumpkins with this approach. Happy hooking, and I'll see you over there.